let you decide with your counterparty whether you might keep the trade on the books with the bank, have your credit arrangement with the banks, as you do now, not be required to move it to central clearing, but at least have the benefit of the transparency.
Right. So what's important to us is that we be able to have that bilateral discussion with the bank, because some of our requirements are unique and long dated and end up.
You would have that on all the customized swaps you want. Absolutely.
So what we're not wanting is to be forced into standardized transactions through an exchange, because that won't fit the risk sort of.
My question is you would completely have flexibility to do all the customization you want, but if you happen to do a standard swap, a one-year interest rate swap that is listed on a trading platform, then the counterparty, the big bank, would have to, on that transaction, expose it to the price discovery function.
Okay. Well, certainly something we'll consider, but you understand that what's important to us is to be able to have this. And I think fundamentally, I mean, you mentioned AIG.
Can I ask you, what wouldn't be good for Boeing and your employees and your stockholders of that?
I'd have to think about it, Mr. Chairman. I think that fundamentally, again, it's the ability to customize, the ability to get hedge accounting, because that is important to us, the earnings volatility issue, and the ability to not be required to post margin because it does take capital.
I've said yes to every one of those.
Okay.
I can't understand how this wouldn't be an unabashed good thing for you.
Right. And I'm not sure that it is, but let me get back to you on that.
Thank you.
All right.
It seems to me that the possibility that you raise of trading standardized swaps which are not cleared in a central marketplace really highlights what would then be happening, which is you would then be giving the liquidity providers of those swaps the ability to tie together simultaneously the pricing of the derivative and the credit component implicit in not requiring collateral. Some people might say that that's anti-competitive because you're tying together multiple services at the same time, and doesn't seem like the right approach. The better approach seems to me to be to recognize that issue and to split those things apart.
Thank you. Donald could come to a judgment.
David, did you have a comment?
Well, I very much agree with what the chairman has been saying here. Again, our position is, and I want to just read out one or two passages because maybe to reassure my colleague on the left here, we're not saying that there shouldn't be any customized derivatives trading in the future, but we want that trading to be properly priced. And we intend to, because we believe is much safer to trade as much as possible and to clear as much as possible, we are going to provide incentives by requiring more capital to be posted for this type of trading in the future. So that is a deliberate policy choice, and it's a policy choice for financial stability, and I repeat that point. So secondly, let me say that we clearly state in our papers that we do not and will not put forward policy which prevents Boeing, in your case, sir, or anybody else, from managing the risks in your business. We're not saying that. And what we say about variation margins is the following. Variation margin requirements, if needed for financial firms, should be tailored in such a way that they do not undermine the corporate sector's ability to use derivatives for transferring risk, especially in the case of companies whose use of derivatives is below a threshold. So there are signals there that we perfectly understand the issues you're raising. But there is a much broader point, and I come back to the broad point, and I come back to the economic damage and the financial stability issues here. That is what's really important. And we believe, as the chairman has said, the more transparent the markets are, you and your firms in the end will benefit from that by tighter spreads, by more transparency, by understanding exactly where the market is. So we want to encourage those trends. We want to clear transactions because we believe it's much safer. And we want the CFTC and our parallel regulators and supervisors to have full information about what's going on in these markets. And that was not the case in this financial crisis. So I don't think we're closing off what you want to do. We're just saying there's going to be an economic price if you don't do it in the more so-called, inverted commas, standardized way or through clearable transactions.
George.
Taking this Boeing hedging example that has been discussed, I think I heard two different things. Chairman Gensler was saying, no, they won't have to put up margin for their customized bilateral long-term derivatives, and Mr. Wright is saying, yes, they would. No?
No. You didn't listen to me. I said variation margins if needed. I said if needed. So first of all, that's not a position.
That's variation margin, but you also talked about an additional capital.
So it depends in terms of the U.S. It depends on the definition of this famous category here under number 4, is it not? About who is covered by the exemption.
I guess I'm still confused because I thought I heard you say that in a bilateral, negotiated, customized swap transaction that a capital deposit would be required.
Well, clearly, what we're saying is that where there is OTC trading, we intend to change the capital requirements rules. So those for banks. So clearly for banks, who will be required to post to have more capital for that type of trading, for the stuff that cannot be centrally cleared. And the Basel Committee right now is looking at that. So that, of course, will, in a sense, add to the cost, or potentially add to the cost. And that price, you would imagine, would increase for the OTC transactions.
And just to clarify, if you like, the administration and this commission, because I testified on behalf of the full commission before Commissioner O'Malley was here, has been supportive of customized transactions that individual hedgers, whether it's Boeing, whether it's small, whether it's large, or even individual speculators, would have an ability to tailor their over-the-counter derivatives and enter into bilateral transactions after any legislation moves forward. The banks providing that service would have capital charges and possibly margin, but certainly be able to provide those customized, tailored transactions to both hedgers and speculators. What I think really the debate is over is that part of the market that can be cleared, or that part of the market that's listed on a swap execution facility, that's so standard that it can be cleared. Is there a requirement? And what I was raising is I think the two are separable. And as our general counsel's office, Terry Arwood, said, it can be separable with Congress's help. I think that was what I was trying to elicit from David, is that I think the legitimate issue that end users have raised about their costs, I side with David Wright. I think it's important not to shift that cost to taxpayers. But if Congress decides to have an exemption for end users from clearing, which I understand may well be what develops, that's what's part of our great democracy. I think that the transparency part of it is something that corporate America has an opportunity right now to influence this debate in a positive way to your bottom line. I'm appealing to your fiduciary duty. I think you should shift that information advantage from the Goldman Sachs's to your left to the Boeings. And there's 5 firms right now that are dominant in this country, in this business. I would think you'd want to shift that information advantage to the thousands of end users.
I'd just like to clarify that I really agree with everything you've both been saying about the benefits to the end users and, of course, to our financial system. I'm not quarreling with it at all. I agree with it entirely.
Is there anything further on this issue, Mike? Did you?
Commissioner, this is Jim Newsom. Can I make
Jim, we can hear you.
Thank you. Certainly, even though I'm on the board of the CME, I don't speak on their behalf. I think the management of the CME has done that quite well throughout this whole debate with both the Commission and the Congress. And I, as well as I know the CME management, has supported the overarching goals of the Congress and the administration to reduce systemic risk. And certainly, I completely understand the conversation here between standardized and customized. But I think on behalf of the clearinghouse standpoint, I wanted to raise an issue with regard to standardized contracts and get both David and the chairman's view. And I think even behind that, the CME has supported the benefits of central party clearing. There's been discussion about whether it should be mandated or whether it should be incentivized, and I won't get into that right now. But contracts that are standardized, even though they are standardized, if they're very infrequently traded, makes it extremely difficult for the clearinghouse to clear, because it's difficult for the clearinghouse to calculate collateral requirements consistent with prudent risk management. I mean, how would you deal with even standardized contracts that are very infrequently traded when it creates a lot of difficulty for the clearinghouse?
Oh, my God. David Wright wanted me to go first. Hi, Jim. It's good to chat with you, even over the phone here like this. And it's an honor to be in the job you once held. I think that what the House bill contemplates, and we support, though there's been various alternatives to this, is sort of two pieces to this, that the regulators, the SEC and CFTC, and the clearinghouses have a role to play in these determinations of what's clearable. But both have a role to play, where the clearing decision is an important one, but it all has to be under robust risk management standards. And one of the key things, I believe, to robust risk management is that a clearinghouse can adequately price the transactions, because clearinghouses mark-to-market transactions on a daily basis and need to have some ability to do that. That's far more accessible in the rate markets, interest rate and currency markets, less so in some of the credit markets and commodity markets. But I think it's central to the question of what is clearable is how well you can risk management a contract. So I suspect there's not going to be, I think there will be a mutual interest between regulators and the markets to make sure that the clearinghouses are robustly managed, and that anything that is deemed to be clearable is done with that in mind. Also, the bill contemplates a public comment to it. I think, if I'm right, Terry Arbor can tell us that if a clearinghouse asks something to be cleared, or if the SEC and CFTC wants it to be cleared, we have to put it out for comment for, I think, 30 days maybe in there, Terry?
Right, that's right.
And though that was recommended by people in Congress, I fully support that. I think that's a good idea, so that the marketplace will be able to comment, and then a determination would be made as well.
Mr. Chairman, I think that flexibility, in very unusual circumstances like the one I mentioned, would be very useful to both the Commission and the clearinghouse. And let me finish by saying I'm glad that I'm not sitting in your chair right now.
Very, very briefly, I think we have a similar philosophy to you here. I think it's clear that there is a role both for CCPs and, of course, ultimately the regulators. We've got to avoid a situation where we have a so-called standardized product, but CCPs say, look, really, we're not, we don't think it's right that this should be centrally cleared. But clearly the regulators at the end of the day have got to make, in our view, general judgments about whether products should be cleared. So we're struggling with this issue. We're struggling about how it works. We can see some dual responsibility here. At the end of the day, of course, I think it is the regulators, supervisors who have to decide. And let's be clear here. We've got to pay a lot of attention to the CCP's views, because we've got to be extremely careful about this concentration of risk and default, and backup, and so forth. Those points that I mentioned earlier. And so robust standards and robust standards for CCP is going to be absolutely essential. But we're thinking our way through this. But I quite like the process that the chairman and council were outlining here.
Is there anything else on those particular issues? I know Mike had.
Just a statement on that, and then I'll go to another question, and that is, I think it's the intent of Congress and certainly this regulator to tell the whole world that the days of cheap risk aversion with the taxpayer as the backstop is over. Now, the good news for the end users is the overpricing of risk management should be over as well, and you should understand more closely what you're paying for, and have some options there. Now, I'd like to change the subject matter here. David, when you were talking about the EU's process, and you laid out that the first year you will have a proposal ready, then it will probably be adopted sometime mid-year. Let me follow up on that, because by the time it gets down to the provincial regulator, the FSA and the BaFin, the CFTC counterparties, what date do you see promulgation of regulations?
Well, Commissioner, it's rather like asking you the exact date when the Congress will agree on your package, but our best estimate at this stage is that we would hope, with good preparation, good coordination, impact analysis, that if we put forward the main legal text in the middle of next year, we would hope, given the urgency of these issues, that we could get these texts to be entering into force around in 2012, and probably towards the end of 2012. Now, that sounds a long time. It's possible we could go faster. We have different legislative techniques here, and we would certainly want to go as fast as possible. But we have an important deliberative process. We have two chambers, member states, and our European Parliament, who have to debate and decide on these matters. So this takes a lot of time. So I'm hoping that within a year of our tabling this work, tabling these proposals, we could get agreement. And if we put them in the form that they're directly applicable to the member states, that sometimes can speed up matters. So I don't want to promise that anything will be implemented in community law before 2012. I think that would be the earliest. Now, we will do everything in our power to make sure that we move as fast as possible. And I believe our finance ministers and our European Parliament understands the urgency to move as quickly as practically possible.
Given that case and the fact that Congress really appears to be fast-tracking it for the U.S., and I know our chairman wants to fast-track our regulations here, what assistance can we assume that we will get from the EU if we begin seeing regulatory arbitrage taking place?
That's exactly, that's exactly the point, isn't it, Commissioner? And First of all, I think what's important is that where we start, where my commission, where our proposals start, I hope will be as close to your positions as possible. We will defend those positions extremely strongly. Assumption being that we can make a good economic case, and I think, as I pointed out, I think we can make a very strong economic case. And then we have to make sure, but there will be a transitional period. I think that's what you're hinting at here, a transitional period where the law in Europe will not be as converged as we hope it will be eventually with the laws in the United States. And that is, I think, something that we'll have to be very practical about on a day-by-day basis. And maybe that's an issue once you have agreed your laws that we should talk further about with our securities regulators and indeed even our banking regulators. But I can't take positions on that. But I see the problem, and I see this transitional phase when you will be applying laws which we won't in Europe. That is something that we will have to manage in one way or another.
And though I think Commissioner Dunn is accurate that this chairman wants to move quickly, because I think the American public deserves no less. I think our taxpayers stand exposed every day we don't do something. I mean, let us not forget we had the worst financial crisis in 80 years. And while these are complex markets, while it's important to get the balance right, we need to do this. I do think we'll have a transition period as well. The legislation as drafted in the House and the Senate provides a period of time for the SEC, the prudential regulators, for the CFTC to write rules, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 12 months. So if the bill, as I would hope, would be signed into law early in 2010 sometime, we'd probably still be writing rules well into the latter part of 2010 and into 2011. Now, depending upon the rule and the different part, there'll be some transition, but probably into late in 2010 and early in 2011.
Let's recall here, Chairman, that of course the G20 has dealt with this matter. The G20 says that we must all get our regulatory systems in order and convergent by the end of 2012, which was the date I signaled to you. I appreciate that you will have a lot of, we call them implementing rules, to implement and decide on thresholds and whatever limits you're going to define for the major market participants. So that's going to take time, and maybe there's some hope we could catch up a little bit here. But there will be. I think we've got to be realistic. There is going to be a transitional period when your laws will be applying and we won't have community law in place. And I think we have to think about how we avoid regulatory arbitrage, for example, in that period. I hope, I'm confident that our leaders in Europe would not want to take advantage of that situation. I think it would be immoral and totally undesirable in the context of solving these problems.
Scott.
Director General Wright, both sides have proposed trade repositories, and I think Terry mentioned that U.S. law is going to provide full cooperation in sharing that data. Will the EU provide the same level of cooperation?
Absolutely. We think that's essential. What's important here is, first of all, the principle of using trade repositories. Secondly, we would hope that we will set up systems here for authorizing and supervising third country repositories on the basis of the types of techniques you were suggesting earlier on, which we call equivalence provisions. I heard General Counsel suggesting that might be part of the Frank Peterson bill. What's important, I think, is here is that our supervisors, let's assume that these trade repositories are going to be in the United States. What's going to be absolutely fundamental for our supervisors and regulators is that they have unfettered access to the information they need to supervise and regulate those markets. Now, that has to be unconditional, has to be uncomplicated. If it is problematic, then I can imagine pressures building up very quickly to say, well, we can't get the information we need, we're going to have to set this up in Europe. I would hope that that would not be the case and that there would be full access. So I'm a big believer in regulatory cooperation and supervisory cooperation. We would, I hope, see repositories, not necessarily in the United States, but subject to high standards, and as long as we have access to the global information, there should be no, in my view anyway, no location requirement.
Tom?
Mr. Wright, I was wondering if I could ask your perspective, if I may, on issue number 9, which is registration of foreign boards of trade. At NYSE Euronext, I believe we're uniquely positioned to give perspective on this issue as a global multi-asset class exchange group. Our strong view is that the current CFTC no-action regime, based on the principles of comparability, has been extremely effective and appropriate, and it's remarkably similar to the FSA ROIE, Registered Overseas Investment Exchange regime. Our concern around registration of foreign boards of trades is that, of course, if it's done in one jurisdiction, there could be reciprocal actions in other jurisdictions, and that you could put up artificial trade barriers between the primary trading centers, and that would be damaging for a number of reasons. On our life exchange in Europe, 1/3 of our volume comes from U.S. clients, so anything that has the potential to block those transatlantic flows, we would view as being destabilizing and unproductive. But also, you have mentioned many times that we need to avoid regulatory arbitrage, and that as we move away from the financial crisis, that we need to work more closely together as international regulators, and that potentially putting in these registration requirements could work contrary to that. So I was just wondering if I could get your perspective from Europe on that issue.
Well, first of all, let me take the general point here about mutual recognition, and I'm talking particularly about securities business and exchanges. You'll be perfectly well aware that we've been arguing for years from the European Commission on behalf of our member states that we should work with the United States to work out mutual recognition regimes. And I guess it was about 2 years ago, even a year ago, perhaps a bit more than that. But we were getting somewhere. We were working very intensively with our colleagues in the SEC, and then the crisis hit us full on, and of course priorities shifted elsewhere. So we are, and have been for many years, very keen to develop mutual recognition regimes for exchanges, for investment business, but without any criticism, we found that approach not to be always fully welcomed and developed here in the U.S. And we've tried. We've tried. Now, in terms of the CCPs, we have a view here which is that CCPs have a different function, and there are systemic issues involved here. And our thinking at this stage is that we would want CCPs, certainly some CCPs, to be authorized and regulated in the European Union. And of course, once we do that, once we come forward with these laws next year, the UK scheme would be replaced by an EU scheme. Now, we're going to listen to all the arguments here, but absent a mutual recognition regime, which as I say, has not been because we haven't been trying. We think because of the systemic issues here, we're going to have to consider, and I say consider because we haven't finalized our policy, that the CCPs should be in Europe. So we have an open mind. I'd like to move forward on a broader context. We've done that in the past with the CFTC. We haven't been able to move forward as fast as we want with the SEC, but we think the way forward in the future is to build up strong regulatory and supervisory systems, both in the US and in Europe, and to mutually recognize each other and trust each other. That's the right way forward. But for legal reasons in the US and for these are complex areas of policy, we know that. That's going to take time. But on the CCP side, we do have some concerns, systemic concerns. And, it come back to that question I asked. Do we need a backstop for CCPs? Well, if we do, who's that backstop going to be? It's going to be the European Central Bank or the European Central Banks, other European central banks, one form or another. So that's where we are at the moment, and we're listening to all the arguments.
Just to recognize that this CFTC has had our mutual recognition program in place for over 20 years, and we have talked about this issue for a lot of years and recognize that we think what we have in place works well. Codifying it may be the direction that we're heading. And Tom, I didn't hear in your comments that you would have a problem with codifying what our current regime is.
No, I tried to be very specific and say that the current regime we view as effective and appropriate.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, one form of codification would be to call it a registration. It would be a different registration, similar to what I believe the FSA has. It has two forms of registration, one that you're probably familiar with, which is their fully regulated regime for entities there, and another is for these foreign, from their perspective, foreign boards of trade. We've had a no-action process where one way to codify that no-action process is to have Congress make a registration requirement for foreign boards of trade, but it would be consistent with what we've been trying to achieve with some enhancements, of course.
I think I heard Jim making a comment. Jim?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Going back to the administration's goal to reduce systemic risk through central clearing, I've got a couple of questions. Maybe Terry Arbit may be the best to address, and I'm thinking again from the clearinghouse standpoint. Terry, is there anything in either of the legislative bills that would impair a clearinghouse's ability to respond immediately to a swap dealer default? And secondly, would all customer collateral be protected in the event of a swap dealer bankruptcy?
Jim, this is Ananda. Can you repeat your first question, because we have problems hearing you.
Hey, Ananda. Yeah, I'd be glad to. Is there anything in either of the House or the Senate bills that would impair the clearinghouse's ability to respond immediately to a swap dealer default?
To a swap dealer default?
Default.
No. I don't see it, no. And then your second question is?
Yeah, would all customer collateral be protected in the event of a swap dealer bankruptcy?
That we haven't seen and I think the chairman alluded to that, we haven't seen, or Terry did, we haven't seen the bankruptcy piece of it in the legislation. nor have we seen any, and correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, nor have we seen any provisions relating to segregation of funds.
Well, they do some of the segregation.
But
There is some segregation.
there is some segregation, but we haven't seen the bankruptcy piece, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Do
Because
you
I
think there will be a bankruptcy piece, or will that be punted until another time?
Jim, this is Terry. Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen on the House side if they're going to the floor this week. We've had discussions with Judiciary Committee staff on the House side. Chairman Gensler, in his letter to the Hill last August, supported bankruptcy provisions and provided some sample text, and we at a staff level very much support it. So, we would do everything we could, but as to whether it happens, that's out of my hands. But.
And Jim, Gary here, I think on the first question, some earlier versions of the resolution authority, not the derivatives bill, but the resolution authority, stayed any obligations under contracts up to 5 o'clock on the day after a default, which I was asked to testify on broader matters, but raised in congressional testimony in front of the House Agriculture Committee, a very real concern that should be that should not go to margin and obligations under clearinghouses, that would in fact undermine the clearinghouse's ability to move quickly. What I don't know is whether that's been modified. We recommended the modifications to the Hill. We still believe those modifications should be that clearing obligations of defaulting swap dealers should be able to be quickly closed out, and that it's actually destabilizing if there's a 36-hour stay.
If I could just one more note on the bankruptcy, the Peterson-Frank substitute does include a provision that the Financial Services Committee had adopted. I think it's 180 days the SEC and the CFTC need to report to Congress on changes that we think should be made to the insolvency regime with respect to swaps. So but that's as far as it goes at this point.
Well, I think as the discussion earlier demonstrated, if we had a segregation and insolvency regime for cleared swaps, which is very similar to, if not the same as that for futures, then we could possibly take care of a default situation in a similar fashion to that which happened in Lehman. But absent one of those, then I don't, it might just be making a situation worse, if not, as opposed to making it better.
I agree. Thank you, Ananda.
Commissioner Chilton.
Now, I was going to ask questions about timing too, but Commissioner Dunn sort of to ask it, and that was helpful. But I did want to not only join my colleagues in thanking David and your colleagues for being here, but say how impressed I am with the document that you have, and I'm struck by the similarities in a lot of them. And so I'm particularly pleased to hear you talk about comprehensive fashion. You talked about Forex. We've talked about metals a lot of times. I think we need to include metals. But just a very impressive document, and I think part of my message, my takeaway from this is we're actually moving in tandem on a lot of these things. Like I said in my opening statement, I'm not as concerned about who goes first, sort of like everybody's sort of jumping in the pool. Everybody's sort of scared at first. But I wanted to make a clarification, too, because the chairman talked about the timing on the legislation, which I think he's probably right. It's probably the end of the first quarter when we might get legislation from the Hill dealing with the OTC market. But that doesn't mean that we may not move forward, and none of us can prejudge what the commission will do, but with regard to position limits on current markets. And so I didn't want anybody to think that we were talking about a year from now there. And as I said, I think, if you go forward in a reasonable way, if you, for example, err on the high side, that this potential of regulatory arbitrage, which I think is a real concern, Commissioner Dunn's raised it a number of times, that maybe that's not as large a concern if you're not clamping down so devastatingly tight that people say, I got to go someplace. I got to go to the OTC market before it's regulated, or I'm going to go overseas. And so I think, like I said at the beginning, if you have a middle of the sort of road, figuring out how to go along, putting on appropriate guardrails, that this sort of stammer stepping between the EU and the U.S. can actually work out very well. So kudos to you all for what you're doing, and thank you again for being here.
Don?
I'd like to raise a different concern, which has to do with the definition of swap dealer in the current legislation. It currently defines as a swap dealer anybody who makes markets in swaps. And swaps are defined as, very cleverly, anything commonly known as swaps. Therefore, even a market
You
participant...
like that, Don, huh?
It's not very technical, but anyway. Therefore, even a market participant that provides liquidity in a swap, which is centrally cleared, will be defined and regulated as a swap dealer. And yet, the Treasury says in their discussion of regulatory reform, which was kind of the precursor to all of this legislation, that derivatives dealers who create large exposures to counterparties should be subject to a robust regime of prudential supervision and regulation, and hence this whole concept of a swap dealer. But clearly, a market participant that exclusively makes markets in cleared swaps and does not make markets in bilateral swaps, which coincidentally is the category in which DRW falls, should not come under this new set of regulations, which is being created to prevent another so-called AIG.
Maybe, Don, we've agreed on a lot of things today, but this one I might take a little bit different side, and it's just one person's view. I'm not speaking for the Commission. But I think just as we regulate all broker-dealers, whether they're the largest multinationals or the smallest, and there's about 6,000 broker-dealers that hold themselves out, we regulate futures commission merchants. I don't remember our count, but it's the largest to the intermediate size. Somebody holds themselves out making market and swaps, we want them to be under the full record keeping and reporting with an audit trail, the business conduct standards. And it may well be that the capital standards would be quite low if they're all cleared. As you said, it might all go to clearing. But I think to bring the registration and regulation only to the 5 big houses and not to other swap dealers, if they're really swap dealers, they're dealing in swaps and holding themselves out to the public, making markets in swap, the business conduct, record-keeping, reporting are valid. And it's a way to get consistent, uniform rules to a marketplace.
I mean, I'm particularly focused on the instance where a market participant may just be making electronic markets in swaps. So there's no issue of holding out necessarily, although they may enter into a market maker agreement with an exchange. But they're just posting prices electronically, just like they do in futures markets. And by the way, in that instance, from an economic perspective, there's probably not a lot of difference between something called a swap, which is cleared, and something which is called a future and is also cleared.
Well, I'd imagine that we'd allow ourselves a chance to debate this as we would go forward in rule writing, because I think the statutory language allows us to define swap dealer as well. But conceptually, and I can't speak for future rule writing, I think that it's more than just the 5 big swap houses if you're really holding yourself out to the public making markets. But I haven't thought through the specifics of, as you say, electronic market making of some sort.
We only have about 10 more minutes left of the meeting today. If anybody else has any issues they'd like to bring up.
May, one comment. Thank you very much for your kind comments, Commissioner, about our position, which, I've been doing this work for 10 years, and I believe that this is a classic area where if we can do a good job together, and I mean that converge our outcomes to the maximum extent possible, given the differences in our political systems, we actually de facto set the world standards here. This is not just EU, US anymore, it's G20, we have emerging countries. We have the lion's share between us of these huge markets. So this isn't just a bilateral discussion, actually. It's a global discussion. It's a G20 discussion. And what is true here, by the way, is true in many other areas. I could list many of them, accounting standards or investment services, banking, you name it. And I do think here that this is perhaps one of the best examples where we have a unique opportunity to do a job of work to make the financial system more stable. I'm repeating what I've said earlier, but from my position, from our position, that's how we see this. And we are going to do everything we can and hopefully convince you about one or 2 points, and you will certainly convince us on some other points that we end up in a closely synergistic sort of outcome. And neither of us can promise what our political systems can deliver, but I think if we say, well, look, our position, both justified economically and justified politically, justified strategically, is very similar to the United States and vice versa. I think it sustains. I think it sustains our positions with our political authorities.
Thank you, David. Do any of my fellow commissioners have a closing comments?
Well, just one other point I was thinking about as you were saying that, David, is that reduces the ability for regulatory arbitrage at other places around the globe, that it won't be a race to the bottom. And even if it is, it would be temporary and short-sighted. So if we do these things in general together, as you say, in tandem, I think that's going to be great for the world. So thanks. And thank you, Jill, and thank your staff, Marcia and Andy, for doing a great job on this.
Yeah, I want to thank all the participants. It's my first GMAC meeting. I want to thank Jill for hosting this meeting. I particularly want to thank David and Patrick and Sebastian and Peter for making the trip this far. I think it's really added to both our knowledge and our debate here at this critical time as our House takes up critical legislation and the Senate, no doubt, will follow if the House, as I surely would recommend that they do, is in passing this historic reform. And I continue to be very optimistic that we have a consensus here to bring the transparency and lower the risk to the system. And moving forward, I want to thank the members of the press corps. And maybe David didn't understand that they were all here, but I think they probably too heard that we really do have quite a consensus here, grappling with similar issues and though different political systems, that it's important that we end up, it won't be exactly the same, but largely the same, will be a very important accomplishment for both of our publics.
Let me join my colleagues in thanking Chairman Sommers for an excellent meeting. I have found this most informative and very, very, very helpful. David, I'll let it be known that we're letting you off a lot easier than you let our chairman off. But I do, the question I ask you, what assistance you would provide us if we did see regulatory arbitrage, I'd like you to seriously think about that and see what kind of feedback you can give us in that arena. Again, for all of your staff, Madam Chairman, and the staff of the International Division, and our General Counsel's Office, and our DCIO group, thank you all for putting together this fantastic meeting.
David, thank you very much for coming. Your testimony and your observations were very informative about how our two countries and well, at least the EU and this country can go down a path together. So I appreciate that. And thank you, obviously, to all the participants, International and DCIO, that gave us some good presentations on Lehman. And then, obviously, Jill and your team that put this together. This is very, very informative.
I also just want to echo all of the thanks to you, our colleagues from the EC, for being here. I mean, I think from certainly the entire GMAC's perspective, this kind of discussion is at the heart of why this advisory committee exists. So we much appreciate you being here today and engaging in the dialogue with these particular market participants, because it's very helpful to this commission. And also thank you to all of the staff from the CFTC who participated, to Roger Liddell and Ron Filler for being here today to help us in our discussions of these very important issues. So the meeting of the GMAC committee is adjourned. We hope to schedule another meeting maybe in late spring to early summer, and we'll try to get on your calendar at an early date this time. Thank you all for being here.